Welcome everyone. Good to see you. And welcome to Sarah, Santa Cruz. And to Jack, who's driving south. And I had the thought that it might look like we're sitting here not moving and that Jack is moving. But actually, from the perspective of the sun, we are moving here in the sendo. I'm not sure of the speed, 20 miles an hour or something like that, 36 kilometres an hour, something like that. And Jack, depending which direction she's driving, is moving faster than us or slower than us. So that might feel like just an idle thought, but actually it's good to remember that the way that we experience the phenomenal world is deceptive. It's just good to remember that the way things appear is not the way things are, and the way things are cannot be known. That there are multiple ways, depending on one's position in time and space, to make sense of reality. What I'd like to talk about today is to encourage all of us to have faith in the breath. And the reason I've been thinking about cultivating faith in the power of paying attention to our breath, which also is shorthand for paying attention to our thoughts and paying attention to our actions and attention to what we are seeing with our senses. So faith in the breath is a shorthand for attention to everything. The reason this is ripe for me just today is that someone asked me the other day, how is all of this relevant in the middle of a war? How is all of this talk about awareness and noticing the breath and so on? How is all of that really relevant if bombs are falling, if you are bleeding, or people that you love are dying? And it might look like it's not so relevant. I can see how it looks like it might not be so relevant. To think about the breath, and to train in paying attention to our breathing. It could seem like it's an additional sort of privileged activity to participate in. And also the teachings on interdependence, impermanence, selflessness, Buddha nature or true nature. It could seem like what point is all of that in the middle of a war? Or in the middle of a crisis of any sort that someone might be having, a flood, a fire, a family crisis. But if we look at some of our most well-known teachers the last century, many of them were forged in the midst of war, in the midst of crises where their faith and commitment to practice was strengthened and realized. Our own founding teacher in the Soto lineage, Suzuki Roshi, was the abbot of a temple in Japan during World War II, where the Americans were bombing the country, where people were lacking in food, lacking in safety, filled with fear, some filled with hatred, some filled with righteous arrogance. And he had to navigate that as a priest. He needed to navigate how was he going to be of most benefit when there was bombings going on all around and people dying. And of course he was a pacifist, and he reminded people in all the various ways that he reminded people that it is not others that we need to fear. It is ideologies of hatred and alienation that are the true enemy. And he often was encouraging people to calm down. Please slow down. Please slow down. Slow down a little. Encouraging people to slow down so that they could think more clearly, not think reactively, not think with hate and not think with fear. Or to not have fear be so dominant that they couldn't think clearly. So our own teacher trained in that environment. And of course, Thich Nhat Hanh trained in that environment in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I will read a little bit from probably his most famous book, The Miracle of Mindfulness, which was actually a letter that he was writing. The whole book is a series of letters that he wrote to a fellow monk who was in Vietnam, and at that time Thich Nhat Hanh had been exiled and was in France. And the Dalai Lama was a teenager when he had to flee Tibet and the Chinese invaded. So for me, reading about their lives, and I would encourage you to read about their lives, is very inspirational and has strengthened my faith that this practice is completely and utterly relevant to absolutely every situation that we might find ourselves in. Both the practice of paying attention to our breathing and our posture, to the thoughts that we are having, to the feelings we are experiencing, to our heart rate, and to the teachings themselves, the core teachings, that they are totally and utterly relevant and beneficial to absolutely every situation we can find ourselves in, without exception. It has to be without exception, or otherwise it's not a true wisdom teaching. It's not a true wisdom practice if it's only applicable here and there. The way it might look will vary. Like to sit in formal zazen will often not be an appropriate response in certain moments in time. Clearly, that might not be the right thing to do at a certain moment in time. Scooping up a child and running down the street may be a far more appropriate thing to do. But we can scoop up a child and run down the street in zazen. We can go searching for water or cooking food for others in zazen. Sometimes I kind of wish my teachers would talk more about the hardships that they've endured. Not just the teachers that I've mentioned, but many of the great teachers. And it's not, I don't think it's an accident that some of the great teachers have endured incredible hardship, and it has transformed them and deepened their practice. It's given them the kind of power of faith because they've seen it work. Sometimes I wish they would tell people about their troubles, but they usually don't. They usually don't. And probably it is wise that they don't, and leave it to others to say, and by the way, did you know that our teacher navigated this difficulty 10 years ago or 5 years ago or currently? So often teachers, even when there's a crisis happening, often give examples that are very ordinary and simple. But that's not because the teachings only apply to ordinary and simple little problems, little challenges. It's just sometimes better to help people be able to listen, to not give too emotive kinds of stories. If it's very emotive, people's might start having kind of, their mind might go off in a tangent, and then they're not listening to the talk anymore. So we could imagine, if we are in a very critical situation, how might our practice be beneficial in a critical situation? Well, I think it would be beneficial if we were in the middle of a crisis, even if we needed to move vigorously. It would be still beneficial for us to be able to notice our environment very clearly, to notice my breathing. Am I breathing faster than I need to breathe? Could I just settle my breath a little bit? Could I slow my thinking down just a little bit? Is my mind racing too quick so that I'm going to miss an important cue that might help keep me alive or keep others alive? We could notice our thoughts full of fear, and is that fear getting in the way of our capacity to just see what needs to be done? Fear often gets in the way of people seeing what needs to be done. Sometimes that fear is very helpful. It kind of gives us a kind of tunnel vision that we need to pay attention to just only what needs to be done. But there's been lots of studies that have shown that in critical situations. Thinking of an example like pilots in an aircraft, sometimes if something's going wrong, they need to have their vision closed down to just what needs to be done. But sometimes that tunneling down that people do out of fear isn't skillful, and they don't know what needs to be done, and they make poor decisions. So my guess is that people who can focus very acutely in the correct way aren't actually being driven by fear so much as being driven by a desire to maintain life, to keep life alive, out of love, even if it's just their own life, but particularly if it's the lives of others. That's what's driving them. And we can notice too if we're getting caught in hateful thoughts and thoughts about the future, potential catastrophes around the corner. All of those things can distract us from reality, from the immediate reality where everything is actually happening. Nothing's happening in the future. Hatred is an idea. There's not a thing called actual hatred. You're not going to find it in front of you. It's not a thing. So mostly in crisis, we do want to pay attention to this actual moment. And clearly the best way to be able to do that is to practice when things are not in crisis. Just like classically it's best to learn how to swim before being tossed into the ocean. So I hope maybe, I hope if you have any doubt that this practice might be, if you have any doubt that it's not relevant to everyone in every situation, I hope these words may help ease that doubt. It's true that in the West, often people don't come to this practice unless they've got some spare time and to do so. So often it looks like it's mostly for people with some privilege. But in other countries, it's not necessarily people of privilege who practice. It's a little bit more that way in the West, but not necessarily so. And it certainly doesn't need to be so. It really is relevant for everyone. And we're just fortunate that we have had the opportunity to encounter it. So I'm going to read the preface to The Miracle of Mindfulness and then read a few passages. The Miracle of Mindfulness was originally written in Vietnam as a long letter to Brother Quang, a main staff member of the School of Youth of Social Services in South Vietnam in 1974. Its author, the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, had founded the school in the 1960s as an outgrowth of engaged Buddhism. It drew young people deeply committed to acting in a spirit of compassion. Upon graduation, the students used the training they received to respond to the needs of the peasants caught in the turmoil of the war. They helped rebuild bombed villages, teach children, set up medical stations, and organize agricultural cooperatives. The workers' methods of reconciliation were often misunderstood in the atmosphere of fear and mistrust engendered by the war. They persistently refused to support either armed party and believed that both sides were but the reflection of one reality, and the true enemies were not the people, but ideology, hatred, and ignorance. Their stance threatened those engaged in the conflict, and in the first years of the school, a series of attacks were carried out against the students. Several were kidnapped and murdered. As the war dragged on, even after the Paris Peace Accords were signed in 1973, it seemed at times impossible not to succumb to exhaustion and bitterness. Continuing to work in a spirit of love and understanding required great courage. From exile in France, Thich Nhat Hanh wrote to Brother Quang to encourage the workers during this dark time. Thai, the form of address for Vietnamese monks, which means teacher, wished to remind them of the essential discipline of following one's breath to nourish and maintain calm mindfulness even in the midst of the most difficult circumstances. Brother Quang and the students were his colleagues and friends, and the spirit of this long letter became the miracle of mindfulness. So this whole book is a series of letters. So I'll read a few passages. And I think it's just powerful to remember the context that these words were being spoken, these words were being written. You know, in the midst of war, this is what Thich Nhat Hanh was writing. Suppose there is a towering wall from the top of which one can see vast distances, but there is no apparent means to climb it. Only a thin piece of thread hanging over the top and coming down both sides. A clever person will tie a thicker string onto one end of the thread, walk over to the other side of the wall, then pull on the thread, bringing the string to the other side. Then he will tie the end of the string to a strong rope and pull the rope over. When the rope has reached the bottom on one side and is secured on the other side, the wall can be easily scaled. Our breath is such a fragile piece of thread. But once we know how to use it, it can become a wondrous tool to help us surmount situations which would otherwise seem hopeless. Our breath is the bridge from our body to our mind, the element which reconciles our body and mind and which makes possible oneness of body and mind. Breath is aligned to both body and mind, and it alone is the tool which can bring them both together, illuminating both and bringing both peace and calm. So I like this image of a thin piece of string to which you would tie a thicker piece of string. Presumably the person on the other side. So I was thinking, if it's just a wall and you could run around to the other side, then like, what's the whole point? But I'm sure there is some logic that I'm missing there. But let's say, think of it in terms of Sangha. That there's Sangha, one on each side of a wall that can't be scaled. But there is this piece of string, which is our breath. And we can train it. And as we train it, the piece of string becomes a powerfully strong rope that can hold all the beings of the universe. It can save all beings. Because none of these terrible things that happen in a vacuum. They all happen because people have thoughts. And they have thoughts. Their thoughts are possible because they're breathing. And the way people breathe influences their thoughts. And people can hate each other. And when people express hatred towards each other, their breathing is usually not slow and deep and calm. It's usually light, short and rapid, high up in the chest. I can imagine that someone could have a very kind of hateful thought and be very still, but that would be a rigid kind of stillness. Sometimes you do see that. When people have gone into a very dissociated state, you see that with mass shootings. But if there's a rigidity in the body, it's not the relaxed, deep breath of zazen. So the breath, you could say, is at the foundation of all thoughts. And it's thoughts that create the world. Because it's thoughts that result in action. And we as a species have this phenomenal power that no species has ever had on this earth to rearrange things. And we are rearranging things. Often people are doing so in beautiful and wondrous ways. We don't get to read about that on the news, but that is happening. Most of the time people are being kind and caring. But we also sometimes intentionally and unintentionally are rearranging things in ways that are harmful. So any time throughout the day we could just become aware of our breath. Like it's always there for us. Always there. Become aware of the breath. A little fearful thought comes into the mind. Just become aware of the breath for a few seconds. And maybe that fearful thought will stabilize. Or it could be an angry thought, judgmental thought, self-deprecating thought. Bring ourselves back to the breath and let that thought stabilize and pass. Here's a few words just on quiet breathing. Your breath should be light, even and flowing like a thin stream of water. Your breath should be very quiet, so quiet that a person sitting next to you cannot hear it. Your breathing should flow gracefully like a river, like a water snake crossing the water. and not like a chain of rugged mountains or the gallop of a horse. To master our breath is to be in control of our bodies and minds. Each time we find ourselves dispersed and find it difficult to gain control of ourselves by different means, the method of watching the breath should always be used. And so when this person asked me about how is this relevant in the middle of a war, in the middle of Gaza, for example, my thought was, well, if it's very relevant. If we are there in a situation like that, trying to maintain some kind of steadiness of mind would be very, very beneficial. If you have a steadiness of mind, you can assess the situation and you can be of most benefit to those around you and keep yourself alive. Steadiness of mind is very, very beneficial in crisis. So I'll just read one more passage. While practicing mindfulness, don't be dominated by the distinction between good and evil, thus creating a battle within oneself. Whenever a wholesome thought arises, acknowledge it. A wholesome thought has just arisen. And if an unwholesome thought arises, acknowledge it as well. An unwholesome thought has just arisen. Don't dwell on it or try to get rid of it, however much you don't like it. To acknowledge it is enough. If you have departed, then you know you have departed. And if you are still there, you know you are still there. Once you have reached such an awareness, there will be nothing you need fear anymore. So this instruction is also about not forcing anything. The emphasis in our tradition is just awareness. Awareness of one's breathing, awareness of one's thinking, awareness of one's environment. We don't have to force anything. We don't have to force ourselves to not think such a thought. Just notice that we're having such a thought. And if we just first bring our full selves to just this awareness of the present moment with an acceptance of the bare fact of it, then from that spot we can take action. But if we don't have this non-attached awareness of things just as they are, an acceptance of our thoughts just as they are, and of our environment just as it is, if we don't have that first, before we take action, then our action is less likely to be wholesome and skillful. And being peaceful just in itself, I think, is very powerful. People appreciate peacefulness, steadiness, like it's a powerful steadiness, not I don't know, what would be an alternative? Not a disconnected calmness because there's no feeling or care, not that kind of disconnectedness, but a steady, powerful, steady calm is very beneficial. People who are freaking out and panicking really like it if there's someone who's steady in a genuine kind of way. They really like it. It's very helpful. All right, well, I hope this encourages all of us to appreciate this incredible gift of our breath that's just with us all the time, we can turn to all the time, and to have strengthen our faith that this practice is useful in every single aspect of our lives, and that we can be beneficial to the world through our practice. Would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? Bill?
I've heard one Dharma talk on YouTube by Jack Cornfield as well, where he was talking about being in Cambodia.
Ah,
Thailand.
do you want to talk a little louder so people can hear you?
talk by Jack Cornfield as well, where he was talking about being in Cambodia or around that area, as the Vietnam War was sort of spilling over the borders and stuff. So
Yeah.
it might also be just like you were talking about with the other teachers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever I hear sort of the story behind some of the great teachers' lives, I don't think I've come across maybe just a couple that haven't had something really major like that. And the only teacher I can think of who hasn't had anything major like that was just an incredibly disciplined person. So, like, their discipline was painful. But most, yeah, I think many teachers have had to practice in harsh conditions, and that's why they're able to be who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it was sort of interesting in Jack Cornfield's talk. It seemed it was sort of different approach to what Thich Nhat Hanh's group did, in that they went out of the monastery and they actively did everything they could in the community to help people. Whereas I think Jack Cornfield was saying at his monastery it was more just sort of, we maintain a very safe and harmonious place where people can come. And he said it was sort of like people can forget that that's possible in the war zone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful gift in the middle of crisis, to have sort of a little island of peace. Even if people don't get to go there, if they know it's there. You know, if you can imagine if you're in the middle of a war and terrible things are happening and you're being tempted to lose faith in humanity completely, but then you remember, up there in the mountains in the mist, there are monks sitting peacefully, paying close attention to pounding rice and cutting carrots and breathing. It just give you faith. Oh, that's our true nature, actually. That's truly who we are. This is delusion. This is ignorance. This is the madness, but it's not really the true way of people. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's a good example of how there's multiple ways to respond to crisis. Some of it's very practical, and others it's kind of... Well, I actually had this thought too, that the way that we share the Dharma, the way that we proselytize, is actually just modelling. And that's what you're describing. You just be it. You be Buddha nature. You be upright. And if people are inspired by it, they come to it. Like in our tradition, we don't go out to tell people about the Dharma. We just be it. We just model it. And people see it. That very much happened with Suzuki Roshi when he went to San Francisco. He was just being himself, and people, influenced by the sort of creative intelligentsia and the beats, would come and say, tell us all about enlightenment, and we want to go to Japan where all the real enlightened teachers are. And he'd say, oh, well, how about first come here in the morning at 5:45 and do Zazen. And so they went like, oh, okay, that doesn't sound as exciting as enlightenment, but okay. And then they'd come and do Zazen at 5:45 and think, oh, there's something about this guy. And it just, person by person, they'd say, I know you could go to Japan, but why don't you just check out this guy? He's only little, but he's amazing. And that's how it happened. And just totally took off. He just modelled it, 5:45 in the morning. And that's where, for us Twining Vines, while we do Zazen every morning, we do it at 6, and we do it on Zoom. But that's where I for me, it's like when I get to Australia, I want to have Zazen every day. And it came exactly from the story of how he did it in San Francisco. Just the simple practice of paying attention to the breath. All the rest is fun and interesting. but it starts right here, in this very chest. It's right here. Fiona?
Thanks, Neti. I joined the Koan class today. The Koan class. I can get caught up with having to be that person for other people, but in the Koan class, someone was talking about the force of nature, when nature, like a sunrise, just allows that feeling of calm and to come, and perhaps that faith that the world is good. So so I'm thinking that I can let go of that and just notice that in teaching it's a two-way process. It's, the students come, the teacher's there. It's and let go of that idea that I can do that for someone else, that that's entirely not my job. That idea.
All right. Let's finish with our Bodhisattva vow and 3 bows. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to become it.